Okay, so a little background before we start reading. So we're just now finishing the Sermon on the Mount. We've been in the Sermon on the Mount for many weeks, and it'd be a nice time to put it into context with the Beatitudes. And there's a whole bunch I guess I'm going to start now. I thought we would read first, but I guess not. So there's a whole bunch I want to tell you about the Sermon on the Mount. And I guess I better have my notes. The first thing I want to say is that it fell out of use for a really long time in the Christian tradition. People just didn't know what to do with it. It's kind of Jesus' first major statement to the world. It's a really big deal, but if you remember what's written in it, it's impossible. It seems almost incredible that he would say all of these things to you. I made a list of just some of it. Well, no, I guess I didn't. All right. So Jesus comes in and he's got this radical message that is challenging everybody's preconceptions about what it means to be what's important. So if you meet people, or if you think about just our country or the planet or any particular group, what do you think is the underlying driving motive of that group? Once you know the underlying driving motive, you know what their idolatry is, right? Because the underlying driving motive of an artist or a friend group or a church, a culture, a society, a military, you name it, the underlying motive, according to Jesus, has to be God. It has to be God. And it has to be the coming under God's influence and coming to God's will. That's got to be the underlying motive of everything. But it isn't, almost never is. So that then you know what's the idolatry. And then you can track from that quite easily what kind of disorder will arise based on what the driving motive is. It's all so simple. Everything is so simple. You can see through everything. Jesus said if you clean the log out of your own eye, then you could see clearly to clean the mote or the splinter out of your brother's eye, right? And you know what he's talking about because to whatever degree you've done inventory in your life for real, to whatever degree you've become free, don't you notice instantly if someone you're around isn't free of that? Don't you start to see, to whatever degree you're free, you can see how free or unfree another person is. And that's true of anybody, anywhere, no matter how kind of freedom they've found, but it's particularly true if you're being freed by Christ, because you're being freed in a very specific way, in a very specific context. And you just start to see the world through that lens. But it's not judgment, it's just seeing. So the Romans at the time of Christ were, their underlying motive was, was totally male dominant. It was machoism. Alpha male, strength, power. And you might think, well, there was homosexuality was allowed, so why? It was allowed, but only if you were on top. And only if you were with a lesser, like a slave or a boy, a young boy. It was completely organized towards male dominance and power. And even though men were married and had children with women in that time, the sex with a woman was considered to be of a lesser quality because you were with a lesser being. So the entire motivation under the Roman sort of notion of what it is important to be was macho, male power. So that's the world Jesus lived in, and then the other world that was contrasted was the Jewish world, right? Because Jesus was a Jew. He was Jewish. The Jewish system produced Jesus. I like to think of things this way. It sure gives you a lot of respect for the Jewish tradition. If the Jewish tradition produced the Savior, that's a big thing. And, coming from the New Age as I did, it was another tradition, Christianity and Judaism, being the two traditions I just didn't think had any power. And if it was Eastern, I was in. If it was shamanic, I was in. Just give me someone from South America, and I'm sure they're on fire. Anything other than Judaism or Christianity. And so what was the Jewish people's idolatry at the time? At different points in history, you might say it's something different. But at the time of Christ, it was the law. It was, I am holy as long as I fulfill all of these rules. And then that makes me holy. And so Jesus comes into this world and he gives the Sermon on the Mount. And he challenges everybody's idea of what's important. You can't help but think how feminine what Jesus teaches is. If you read the Beatitudes, you cannot help but notice how soft and feminine he is asking us to become in order to receive easily God's power. In order to be receptive to God's power, we become feminine. We become humble, meek, soft, quiet. So all these energy, all these moods, all these things that we must adopt in order to receive the power of God. And it just doesn't match what the Romans are saying life is about. And it doesn't match what the Jewish people at the time were doing either. Because they had sort of a self-made spirituality. You wouldn't be surprised to find that if you were rich in the Jewish tradition at that time, it was a reward from God. That was proof you were doing it right. You had become rich. Jesus comes in and says, rich people are very, very, very unlikely to ever get to heaven. I mean, he's very clear. There's no way to read the New Testament and come out of it thinking rich people have a very good shot at heaven. Think about that. He comes and he gives this Sermon on the Mount, and everything he's saying is turning the world upside down for all of the listeners. That's the important thing to know. And he gives it on the Mount, and if you're Jewish and a teacher gives his main sermon from, it's really probably a hill, but Sermon on the Mount, you immediately know that there's a correlation with Moses and Mount Sinai. You immediately know that if a teacher gives there's a symbolism there that didn't go missed. It wasn't missed by Jesus choosing that place to give the sermon. So all the listeners, all the Jewish people who came to hear him, they're saying, Jesus is telling us he's the new lawgiver. Jesus is saying he's the new Moses. This is a very big statement Jesus is making just from where he chose to give the speech from. I think that's profound. You want to know that. Noah's Ark was supposedly found on top of a mountain after the flood drained, and all kinds of powerful things. Elijah did a massive miracle there to prove the authority of the one God on top of a mountain. It's all through, and so you have to understand that symbolism was apparent immediately to the Jewish people, and Jesus wouldn't have chosen the Mount either as a place to give his first sermon if he didn't intend for that symbolism to be noticed. That's important. Okay. And he comes in, he shatters these preconceptions, and I'm not going to refer to notes at all. It's just messing me up. Okay, so he gives the Sermon on the Mount, but he says things in the Sermon on the Mount that are extreme. And the reason the Sermon on the Mount fell out of use in Christianity, the reason preachers just avoided it and didn't teach from it, is because it's clearly impossible for any listener entering into Christianity to adhere to. He's asking so much of us. In the end, he says, therefore be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. And he says, if you lust after anyone other than your own wife or husband, tear your eye out from you. It's better to go into eternal life maimed than to not go. So he's saying, just don't ever lust over anyone but your chosen partner. And everyone's saying, well, I don't know if I can pull that off. Right? I don't know if I can do that. And he's saying it's difficult to enter into heaven if you're rich. And he's saying so many statements that are so extreme and so difficult and impossible to follow that later generations of Christianity just avoided it. And in doing that, kind of we lost the entire thrust and meaning of it. And, that's one good thing you'd like to know. And there were several, so here's modern thinkers, okay? Modern thinkers start saying, well, geez, what is the Sermon on the Mount about then? And they started trying to find solutions for how to reconcile how impossible this is and how off-putting it is to hear with his words. So there were all these theories that they came up with. And one of them was, they said, well, it's just counsels, it's not commands. He's not commanding anything here. He's just saying this would be good. If someone slaps you on one cheek, it would be good if you turned the other cheek to them. And if someone defrauds you, it would be good if you allowed them to defraud you, because what do you care? Right? Like they're saying it would be good, but he didn't expect anyone to be able to follow it. But that doesn't square, obviously, with all the statements he makes in the Sermon on the Mount. So that's just one attempt that failed to try to reconcile this impossible piece of literature, this impossible speech he gives. The other one, another sentiment that came about is it's just sentimental. He just wants you to want that, but he's not saying you'll ever get there. So that was another way they tried to reconcile this. He just wants you to want that, but you're never going to get there. All of these are true in part, but none of these are wholly true. Another one that came about trying to reconcile the Sermon on the Mount while no one was reading it to anybody was that it's only an end times prophecy. It's only how you would live and what you would do if it's the very end times. And so it's not useful for regular life until it's the end times. Because, if you let someone defraud you, you lose your home. Right? And if you let someone defraud you and it becomes known that Christians let you defraud them, how long would it take for Christians to have nothing in this world? It wouldn't take long at all. I can't remember, it was Voltaire or which philosopher said it's a social program. He's telling you what he wants you to structure a Christian-based society on and codify into law. That all this is how it has to be done. And we should force it through law. And complete with maybe jail for people that don't follow it. And then that didn't work. And then the last one, the Protestant sort of way to try to reconcile it, is that it was never, ever meant to be fulfilled. Only Jesus can fulfill it. It's only part of the Old Testament law. Jesus is just reiterating the Old Testament law, and he's just telling you that you are saved, and so it doesn't matter if you can never follow any of that because you're saved anyway. That's the Protestant view. And that makes sense if you know Protestant theology. Okay. So people just stopped reading it. They just gave up on it. And it just fell out of use. Because it's so difficult and so hard. And you read these statements, and if you're responding to it in the way that the people from these centuries responded to it, you go home dejected, thinking I'll never be able to do it. I'm never going to be good enough. And there's no freedom in that notion that you'll never be good enough. As we know great freedom when we say that. If I say I'll never be good enough, I feel profound peace and comfort and warmth flood my body. But if you say it the way these people said it, I'll never be good enough, you're a little pissed, a little annoyed, a little frustrated, maybe condemning yourself, maybe feeling guilt or shame, Or maybe feeling some rebellion. Like, I'll just kick the system back because the system's kicking me. Maybe I'll rebel against it. Right? We know these maturities, these stages people come to in here, where finally they say, I'm not good enough, and it's an incredible feeling. Right? One person before the night says, I'm not good enough, they're in shame. They want to give up, they want to quit, they're mad. On the other side of a certain awakening, the same person says, I'm not good enough, and they're emanating peace. They're emanating peace. There's no low self-esteem in it at all. It's good self-esteem. The sin here that these generations of Christians made, and that we need to not make, when we read Jesus' hard statements, there's many that are very difficult. Never get divorced. I mean, his disciples said, if I can't get divorced, then it would be better if I never married. You know, it's so funny when you hear him, so you just laugh so hard, because you're like, yeah, I get it, I'm married, I understand. But, you know, and those of us that are married sometimes smirk and laugh when we hear people talk so passionately about how they just wish they had a lifelong partner, and we're like, well, you don't really know what you're asking for. Wait till you get it. First you complain about being single, then you'll complain about being with someone. That's how it goes. And a lot of times the complaining about being with someone is worse than it was when complaining about being single. It's really funny. But Jesus comes in and they're allowing divorce, and he strengthens that prohibition. He makes it more intense. He's more against divorce than the Jewish tradition already was. He's against wealth in a way the Jewish tradition wasn't. In some ways, he comes in and he's much more strict. And in other ways, he comes in and he's much more loose. And he's just reversing everyone's understanding. People don't know what to make of him. The sin is self. The sin is self. You read these impossible statements. If you come to it with maturity, if you come to it with sincerity, you read all of the things Jesus said and you say, yes, 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 for sure. All of it. Even the ones you don't understand. Even the ones that seem impossible and difficult. You don't cross your arms and say no. You say yes, 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 God. I don't know how and I don't know when. But yes, that's the proper way to receive these difficult statements. But the immature way, the natural way, the way of the natural man, is to say, I won't go until I understand it. I could give you an example, because it's happened many times with people I work with. They have all kinds of problems, and they don't know the causes of those problems yet, and they don't know the solution to the problem yet. And we can look at them and say, humility would cure about 90% of these problems. So you say, you just need to grow in humility. And there's rebellion. Rebellion against the notion, rebellion against trying it, an insistence on solving these specific issues, that humility would solve all of them. But because they can't understand yet why humility would cure it, they won't try. So one of the sins is the sin of having to understand first before having faith. So it's idolatry. It puts understanding before faith. And the other sin that's always involved in this, rejection, that caused Christianity itself to reject the Sermon on the Mount for a good long time is thinking you have to save yourself. You read these things, you know for sure you can't do them. And so you reject the teaching itself because you can't pull it off through your own self-effort. That's again just the sin of self, the sin of pride. So, how it all got resolved, the whole issue of the Sermon on the Mount, how do we resolve it? If you've been here a while, you already know. This is mostly from Augustine, okay? But the Desert Fathers wrote about it too. It's everywhere. They said, the whole Sermon on the Mount is one teaching. And it looks like Jesus gave us the seed of it in the Beatitudes. So we hear these statements that are impossible to follow. You can't do it. You can't do it. But he's saying you will, and you need to. So he's first saying, here's what you've got to do. This is like the new law from Jesus. Here's what you will be able to do. Here's what it will look like. Say yes to all of this. If you say, yes, I will do it, you immediately come up with a deep, strong knowing that you cannot. That you just cannot. You need that strong knowing that you cannot in order to pray sincerely for aid. You have to be up against an impossible wall. You have to be. Because only then can you pray with the desperation and sincerity and true need that is required to open one's heart to God and allow God's power to enter your soul. And sometimes life brings us situations that are impossible to accept. And it's the same process. I will, God, I will. But I can't. But I will. Now, if you'll only get me there. So they started looking at the literature from the early church leaders. And they saw all of the Sermon on the Mount as one teaching, and Jesus giving the map on how to get there in the Beatitudes. So poverty of spirit. I can't do it. I'm nothing. I'm nobody. I have nothing. I have nothing in myself that can do this. And mourning our sin, mourning our inability to live a holy life. And meekness, the surrender that finally comes when we've worn ourselves out, trying to do it our own way. And people come to it just through hardship. They don't have to have read this scripture. A lot of people come to it just from getting beat up by life. And they just come ready to do something different because what they've been doing is not working. Marriage can do it to people. I don't know why I'm on marriage today. It's so funny. So many things can do it to a person. Where you realize, I cannot do a successful life. So that's how the Beatitudes came back into favor in Christianity. They returned to the early church fathers who taught the deep meaning of the Beatitudes, and they taught stages. Stages. It's so important, stages. If you tell someone never lust over another woman or man again, that's the rule. Stop. It's deeply sinful. You're asking someone to do something that is impossible for them. You still tell them. You still tell them. And then you say you got about 8 or 9 years to pull that off with God's grace. And there's a process on how God can heal a person of this. There's a way God can get a person here. You tell someone you have to love everyone. You love everyone. Even the people who hurt you and harm you and hate you. And Jesus says, who spitefully use you. If you tell a new person that, they could give up. But you do tell them. But then you tell them about the stages it takes to get there. The known stages that bring a person to a place where they could do those things. And those stages are the Beatitudes. So in the Sermon on the Mount, it's not like Jesus gave you everything you need to know, but he gave you a massive outline of everything you need to know, what it is like to be a Christian, what it is like to be a child of God. And here are the map of the stages that you will grow into that allow this to be possible. And no one in the first stage is expected to be able to do what a person in the third stage can do. No one expects that, but you're called to it. And you can see how if you don't raise that ceiling, you would never get there. Right? You've got this power in you as Christ leading you somewhere. His power is in you, growing you to something. It's taking you somewhere. But you're not totally blind because he's showing you what it is you're being taken to. Jesus says, never swear oaths, right? He said, don't swear oaths. We know the reason why is because he's saying, if you have to promise, it's because lies are already prevalent in your community. So it's deeply sinful. That's just deeply sinful. That's what he's saying. Why not swear an oath? Because if you have to promise, then everyone's a liar. The people who make you promise lie because they're dealing with liars, and you lie because you got to promise. He's saying your yes should be yes and your no should be no, and that should be it. So he says never swear oaths. And then in the New Testament we find Paul swearing oaths. And Jesus says, turn the other cheek. If someone wants to harm you, turn the other cheek. And then you find Jesus breaking out a whip and violently chasing people out of the temple. You find the Romans accusing Jesus, and rather than Jesus just humbly turning the other cheek, he's calling them vipers. So what is that? That's the part of how people got so confused. But see, he wasn't laying down another law to follow all the time. Here's what he's laying down. Think who you would have to be. Think what you would have to give up to be able to follow everything he's saying perfectly. You know what he's saying? He's saying be able to do all of that. And he's giving you his preference. He's giving you his baseline preference for your behavior. Once in a while, violence, sure. Once in a while, answering an argument, sure. But what's the baseline? He's showing you the baseline. Here's what it is. And then what he does immediately, we'll read the rest of the Sermon on the Mount, is just a tiny little bit of text that's left. And then what he does immediately is he goes down and starts working profound miracles so no one can doubt he knows what he's talking about. He just immediately goes down into the towns and starts curing people's illnesses, raising people from the dead, demonstrating his authority. So what we could do is just read the last of it, which starts at verse 15. So this is just the end of the Sermon on the Mount. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ravenous wolves. You will know them by their fruits. Do men gather grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Even so, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Therefore, by their fruits you will know them. Not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, shall enter the kingdom of heaven, but he who does the will of my Father in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in your name, cast out demons in your name, and done many wonders in your name? And I will declare to them, I never knew you. Depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. Therefore, whoever hears these sayings of mine and does them, I will liken to a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it did not fall, for it was founded on the rock. But everyone who hears these sayings of mine and does not do them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain descended, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. And so it was, when Jesus had ended these sayings, that the people were astonished at his teaching. For he taught them as one having authority, and not as the scribes. So, just one last little bit to say about it, and we'll open it up. This isn't obligation. Jesus is saying all these things that seem so hard. It's not obligation. He's saying, blessed are you if you do these things. He's saying, here's the way to perfect happiness. It's never, here's all these rules laid on top of you, the heavy, hard rules you got to follow, and yeah, it's going to suck, but it's the right way. It's not what he's saying. He's saying, here is the way to infinite joy. Here's the way to infinite love. And if you read the Beatitudes, we gave such great talks on it. I think they were done well. It just in alignment with the Desert Fathers and the early church fathers, that they're just natural stages that when you get one, you naturally grow into the next. And when you get that, you grow into the next. And one day, on your path, when you've been humble and quiet and meek and willing to undergo ego death over and over, one day it dawns on you that you need love. Not because you have aspirations to be great spiritually, but because you could just see how much that love is needed in your actions. And that's the day when the caterpillar crawls into a cocoon and says, something very missing. There's something so wrong. Even though it's come so far, it goes into a cocoon and comes out a butterfly. And that's the same as saying, Pentecost is coming to your life. That at some point, you're going to be touched by tongues of fire, and that the entire life you've known and the entire way you've lived it is going to be radically transformed in ways that after years on the path you have no inkling of. No way of seeing it coming. An entirely new world and way of being and energy, entirely new energy to live in. And that's natural stages, natural. Just come under Christ's guidance and you naturally grow into these places. Naturally. In my meditation today, I was very aware of that for the center. I wasn't trying to see, but I was very aware that is your future. To awaken to infinite love. That's everything I wanted to say.